the forest woman who follows children home. I want to start by telling you what I did wrong. Not because I think it changes anything at this point, not because knowing will make you feel better about how this ends, but because when I look back at that summer, really look at it the way you only can once enough time has passed and the shame has cooled to something you can actually hold, I can trace everything back to one decision. One small, ordinary thing I did in the first week of August. I let my daughter play in the woods alone. She was 9. We had just moved to Delhart, a small, unincorporated community in rural Pennsylvania, roughly 40 minutes from the nearest proper town. The house was old, but livable. 3 acres of yard that bled into the tree line at the back, a gravel driveway that curved through second-growth timber, and neighbors spaced far enough apart that in the evenings, the only sounds were insects and the low complaint of tree branches in the wind. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 37 years old, recently divorced, and operating on that particular brand of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. My daughter, Mara, was adjusting badly to the move. She wasn't speaking to me with any warmth. She wasn't speaking to much of anyone. So when she started spending her afternoons outside, drifting toward the tree line, spending hours in the shallow woods at the property's edge, I was quietly relieved. I told myself it was healthy. I told myself kids needed space. The first thing she said, the very first indication that anything was wrong, came on a Thursday, late afternoon. She came inside with her shoes muddy and her hair tangled, and the particular look on her face she gets when something has excited her more than she wants to show. "There's a lady in the woods," she said, just like that, conversational. I was at the kitchen counter. I didn't turn around immediately. "What kind of lady?" "Tall. She has a hat, like a big one." "A gardening hat?" Mara considered this. "Wider." I turned around then. She was already looking at her phone, the moment already passing. I asked if the woman had said anything. Mara shook her head. I asked if she'd seemed lost or if Mara had felt scared. Another head shake. "She was just standing there," Mara said, "watching." I told her not to go near strangers in the woods. She gave me the look that 9-year-olds reserve for statements this obvious. I told her I was serious. She said she knew. That night, I walked the tree line with a flashlight for about 15 minutes. Found nothing. Some deer tracks, a rusted fence post from an old property boundary. I stood at the edge of the darkness where the trees thickened, and I listened. And there was nothing but the insects and the distance. And I went back inside feeling like an anxious man who had done his due diligence. I didn't call anyone. I didn't mention it to neighbors. I didn't look into it. That was the decision. That one. The following week, I met the Polosic family at the end of our road. Tom and Diane, their 2 boys, 8 and 11. We'd waved at each other in passing, but not properly spoken. Diane flagged me down when I was checking the mailbox on a Tuesday morning. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Did your daughter mention seeing anyone near the woods?" she asked. She said it quickly, like she'd been rehearsing. I felt something settle cold in my chest. She mentioned a woman in a wide hat. Diane looked at her husband. Tom had his arms crossed and was looking at the ground with the expression of a man who was deciding how much to say. "Our boys saw her too," Diane said. 3 separate times over the past 2 weeks, always at the edge of the property, always just standing. I asked if they'd reported it. Tom said they'd called the county non-emergency line. A deputy came out, walked the tree line, found nothing, told them it was probably a hiker or someone cutting through from the old state game land to the north, told them to call back if she approached or made contact. We stood in the road for a few minutes talking the way you do when everyone is trying to sound calm and no one actually is. We agreed to keep an eye out. We agreed to compare notes. We said it was probably nothing. Probably. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. Mara was standing at the back window, looking toward the tree line. The knocking started 6 days after that conversation. The first time I assumed it was the house settling. Old houses do that. Delhart had been in a dry stretch and the nights were cooling faster than the days, and wood expands and contracts and makes sounds that your sleeping brain interprets as patterns. But it wasn't random, that was the thing. It was 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. Slow, deliberate, like someone who wasn't in a hurry. It came from the back of the house, near the kitchen door which opened onto the yard. I lay in bed the first night listening to it for maybe 20 minutes before I convinced myself I was hearing something innocuous, a branch, an animal, the house itself, and managed to sleep. The second night it came earlier, around 1 in the morning. 3 knocks, a pause long enough that I almost relaxed, 3 more. I got up. I took the flashlight and I unlocked the kitchen door and I stepped out onto the back step and I shone the light across the yard and into the tree line. Nothing moved. I stood there for a while. The yard was empty. The grass was still. The trees were just trees. I stepped down into the yard and walked toward the back, slowly, the flashlight cutting a pale cone through the dark, and I got about halfway across before I stopped. I stopped because I realized I was doing the thing you're not supposed to do. I was walking toward the thing I was afraid of, alone, in the dark, with nothing but a flashlight, because I wanted to prove it was nothing. I turned around and went back inside. I locked the door. I stood at the window. Nothing. I called Tom the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been awake. "Yeah," he said when I described it. Just, yeah, like I'd confirmed something he'd been sitting with. Their knocking had started 4 nights ago. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. His boys had woken up the second night and come into their room frightened, saying someone was outside. He checked, found nothing. "I've been outside 3 times," he said. "Each time, nothing." We talked through explanations. Kids from another neighborhood messing around, a vagrant, someone with a grudge against both our families, which made no sense because we just moved here and barely knew anyone. We talked around the obvious shape of it, the woman in the hat, the children, the knocking that came after, without saying it directly, because saying it directly meant taking it seriously in a way neither of us was ready to do. "I'm going to talk to some other people on the road," Tom said. He called me back that afternoon. The Ostroff family, 3 houses north, their daughter was 12. She'd seen a tall woman at the edge of their property 2 weeks ago. The knocking at their house had started 5 nights ago. The Marchetti couple at the end of the unpaved fork, no children, they hadn't noticed anyone in the woods, no knocking. The pattern was clear. I didn't say it out loud to Tom, but we both knew. She was following the children home. I want to tell you about the week between that realization and the night everything changed, because that week is where I think most of the damage happened. Not the physical kind, the other kind. Mara started sleeping poorly. She wouldn't tell me why at first. Then, one night I heard her crying quietly in her room, and I went in and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she said, "She comes to my window." I kept my voice even. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "At night, I can hear her outside my window. She doesn't knock, she just stands there." "How do you know she's standing there?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "You can hear her breathing." I had Mara moved into my room that same night. I didn't make a big deal of it. I set up the air mattress and said we were doing a campout, and Mara was too old and too tired to pretend she believed that, but she got on the air mattress without argument and was asleep within 20 minutes. I lay awake until 4 in the morning. I heard nothing. I told myself that was good. We had a meeting. Me, the Paliseks, the Ostrovs, stood in the Paliseks driveway on a Sunday afternoon while the children played inside, and we tried to act like adults solving a problem. The general consensus was that it was a person, a real flesh and blood human person. The behaviors, the watching, the following at a distance, the nocturnal knocking were calculated enough to suggest deliberate intent. Someone wanted us unsettled. Someone wanted us to feel watched. The sheriff's office had been called again. We were told to document incidents, to install lights, cameras if possible, to not engage if we saw her. Tom had put up a game camera on his fence line facing the tree line. 4 nights of footage. 3 of those nights, motion had triggered the camera at 2 in the morning. In 2 of those clips, you could see, and I am being precise here, something at the edge of the frame, a shape, tall and vertical, present in one frame, gone in the next. The hat in one frame was unmistakable. We looked at those clips in Tom's kitchen, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Diane said, very quietly, "She doesn't look like she's in a hurry." That was the thing. That was what nobody had been saying out loud. She didn't run, she didn't hide. She stood in the open at the edge of the frame, and then she was gone. No scrambling, no urgency, just presence, and then absence, like she was deciding. I made a mistake during that week. I want to be precise about this because I've spent a lot of time reconstructing it. I thought I knew which direction she was coming from. There was a gap in the fence line at the northwest corner of my property where an old gate had rusted off its hinges. The ground there was soft from a low drainage area, and I found impressions in it. Boot prints, large, narrow, pointing inward. I photographed them. I showed Tom. We agreed this was the entry point. I set up a motion-activated floodlight aimed at that corner. 2 nights later, the knocking came from the front of the house, the front door, the street side. I had been watching the wrong direction the entire time. I stood in the hallway at 1 in the morning, in the dark, and I listened to 3 knocks on my front door, and I did not open it. Mara was asleep in my room. I had my phone in my hand. I stood very still and I listened. 3 more knocks. Then, nothing. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, drove slowly down the road, shone a light around, found nothing, told me to call back if there was physical contact or property damage. I asked him, as he was leaving, how many calls like this they'd gotten in the past month. He paused. Then he said, "It comes and goes out here." I asked him what that meant. He said, "Every few years, usually settles down on its own." He got in his cruiser and drove away, and I stood in my driveway and watched the tree line, and the tree line watched back. And somewhere in there I understood that nobody was going to solve this for me. The last incident I'll describe happened on a Tuesday night in mid-September. Mara had gone back to her room. She said she felt silly sleeping on an air mattress, and I understood because routine is armor for children, and she was trying to rebuild hers. I left her door open. I left the hall light on. I fell asleep around 11. I woke up at 2:47. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone. I woke because the knocking had stopped. Not because it had started, because it had been going. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. And at some point in my sleep, it had registered as background. And then the absence of it woke me the way silence wakes you in a house where a clock has stopped. I lay still for a moment. The hall light was still on. I could see the pale rectangle of it through my open door. Then I heard Mara's voice, very quiet, from her room. She wasn't crying, she wasn't calling for me. She was speaking in a low conversational murmur, the kind of voice children use when they're half asleep and dreaming. I was out of bed before I finished understanding what I was hearing. I crossed the hall in 2 steps and pushed her door open, and she was in her bed, asleep, her eyes closed, and her window was open. The screen was in place. Nothing had come through. The window opened inward from the bottom and it had been pushed up maybe 8 inches, and the night air was coming in cool and smelling of autumn and wet ground. I closed the window. I locked it. I sat on the edge of Mara's bed until she stirred and looked at me with the confused patience of a child interrupted from deep sleep. "Go back to sleep," I said. She did. I sat there with my back to the wall and watched the window until the sky began to lighten outside. Pale at first, then gray, then the particular blue of early morning that means the night is over, really over, and you survived it. I haven't heard the knocking in 11 days now. The Paliseks say they haven't heard it either. Tom's game camera hasn't triggered on the tree line in 2 weeks. The Ostros said theirs stopped around the same time. The shape at the edge of the frame is gone. Mara doesn't talk about the tall lady anymore. When I've tried to ask, carefully, casually, she shrugs and changes the subject in the way children do when something has been filed away under "don't think about this," the way you do when you're 9 years old and you've decided to be okay. I tell myself that's healthy. I tell myself kids need space. I watch the tree line. The tree line does not move.